Hello students, today we're going to talk about the structure of an A through E persuasive closing. The closing paragraph in your speech is really important because it is your last chance to convince your audience members that what you are saying is valid and the correct way of thinking. It's your last impression that you are going to leave with them about your argument. So you want to be forceful, you want to be focused, and you want to be persuasive in this. Through this A through E structure for the closing paragraph. The first sentence of your closing should reassert your thesis statement in reverse thesis form. So hopefully at this point you have a strong revised thesis statement in the introduction paragraph. And so all you have to do is create that structure, which you are so familiar with at this point. The second part is where you reaffirm for your audience why your argument matters. And this is the B and C sentencing of the conclusion. This is where you should refer back to the strongest piece of evidence and warrant from the body of your speech. So you need to look back at your body and decide upon that strongest evidence warrant pair. Decide what you really feel is going to leave that impression on your audience members. Is it going to be a strong statistic that you mentioned? Is it a strong study that you discussed in the body of your speech? Decide what's going to really be the strongest in leaving that impression on your audience members. Then lastly, the D and E sentencing is where you want to relate your argument to your audience members. You want to show that real world connection to your argument. How does the argument relate to your audience members' lives? By doing this part, you are connecting emotionally and personally to your audience members. And when you do that, it is more likely that they are going to remember your argument and take it to heart, which is exactly what you want in a persuasive speech. So in this last part, you should offer that cautionary or beneficial remark that you've already drafted from your in-class essay. So you'll want to revise that and remind them how your argument connects to their lives. A part that you can add to this sentencing is a possible additional crappy quote that reinforces or introduces that cautionary or beneficial statement. And we will talk about that piece in a little bit if you're interested in adding that additional crappy quote. In addition to these three parts of the closing, you will also want to think about diction that's going to evoke pathos in your audience members. You want to really connect to them emotionally, evoke some sort of pride or outrage, guilt, inspiration from your audience so that, again, they are connected to your argument in some way. You also should incorporate rhetorical devices to add that persuasive flair to your closing, just as you did in your introduction paragraph. So there are three main closing strategies that we're going to talk about. The first one is to echo the introduction. And this strategy is best placed after your reverse thesis in the B sentencing part of the closing. And this can really be useful in creating unity in your speech or your essay if you're writing it, because you are reiterating something that you talked about in your introduction and bringing it up again in the closing to again bring your audience members full circle with your argument. So for example, if you begin by describing a scenario, you can end with that same scenario as proof that your essay was helpful or your speech was helpful in creating some new understanding for your audience members. If you begin a quote or rhetorical question, you might consider reasserting some of the main ideas, queries, or diction that you mentioned in your introduction connected to that hook or that quote hook or rhetorical question. The second closing strategy is to incorporate a crappy quote. And this would be best in that DE sentencing, as I mentioned on the last slide. And you can either use this crappy quote to introduce or reinforce that cautionary or beneficial statement, Or you could consider using it after the cautionary beneficial statement to reinforce the warnings or benefits that you just discussed for your audience. If you decide to incorporate this new crappy quote, some things to remember: you want to make sure that you establish ethos of the speaker of that quote. You would also want to insert some diction that creates a smooth transition from the crappy quote into the cautionary beneficial statement, or from the cautionary beneficial statement into the crappy quote if you decide to place it after that cautionary beneficial statement. The last closing strategy is to use those rhetorical devices, and you can insert these anywhere within your closing paragraph from the B3 sentencing. You just want to make sure that wherever you are including these rhetorical devices, you are including them to leave that powerful punch of persuasion for your audience members. And so let's go ahead and talk about rhetorical devices that I think are really powerful in closings. The first you might consider is anaphora, because this can really strengthen a cautionary or beneficial statement. It can remind your audience of that strongest reasoning warrant. Amplification is another option that is really useful in a closing because, again, it helps you elaborate on your strongest argument or creates a lot of urgency for the cautionary or beneficial statement that you're mentioning to your audience members. Asyndeton and polysyndeton are also really useful in getting your points across for the final time and leaving that final impression on your audience members. So on this slide, I have an ineffective closing. And so let's go ahead and read it together and decide why it is so ineffective and not very persuasive. So it says, I have given you 3 truthful explanations of why daily homework is bad for the high school. This is due to problems with participants and after-school events, the time we spend with our families, and our jobs. Thank you for allowing me to express my feelings. This does not persuade the audience to do anything. It simply restates the thesis statement about homework, but it doesn't leave me with any connection to my life. So I'm pretty bored with this closing, and I'm not going to remember a lot about this person's argument, unfortunately. So you do not want your closing to look like that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some samples of strong persuasive closings so you can see some of the strategies we talked about in the last slide put to use. So this first sample is echoing the introduction. And you'll notice in red that I have some rhetorical devices embedded as well to show you how those are powerfully persuasive in this example. So let's go ahead and look at the introduction paragraph first so that you can hear the anecdote that I began with in this introduction paragraph on torture. So it reads, the group of men and women in matching dark gray suits entered the isolated room and approached the feeble man in the back corner. They simultaneously examined their next victim with sick eagerness reeking from them. Eventually, the victim's bloodshot eyes rose and caught their excited gazes, and he began to twitch in fear. The man in the corner knows what is coming next and braces himself for the pain. And so it comes. The metal restraints and wires around his body sparked and electrified his whole being. The excruciating pain was unbearable, but he still didn't have anything to confess. He is innocent, much like the thousands of others in the world who have been tortured despite the rule of law. And so that was the anecdote for the introduction, a really powerful anecdote to get the audience's emotions going for this argument. So if we look in the conclusion, you're going to notice in bold is where I mention some of that anecdote from my introduction that we just read. So let's go ahead and walk through this conclusion paragraph. In conclusion, even though it endangers the safety of the people, the United States has repeatedly used torture. So beginning with my reverse thesis there, And now where I echo the introduction. The man in the chair remembered the terrible torture suffered at the hands of the Americans as he recovered from his most recent suffering. If he were ever released, he would preach about the terrible treatment publicly to the American people. So this is a really strong echoing of the introduction because I am engaging the audience members' emotions with that horrible, very powerful anecdote that I began my speech with. Then I continue, but would the people believe him? Would they even pretend to understand and care? Powerful use of rhetorical question there. No, because they care more about their own safety and are brainwashed by society and government and false truths. So using that polysyndeton purposefully here to reaffirm one of my strongest arguments in my speech. The individual need for self-preservation and the greed for intelligence surpass the very basic morality of the world. Torture inevitably forms powerless societies, but even worse, creates helpless victims. So parallel structure, again, focuses my audience members here on some of the strongest evidence that I have stated in my speech. And then finally ending here, each country must work together to overcome torture. If torture is not eradicated soon, more and more innocent human beings will continue to die under excruciating and unbearable pain. So ending with that cautionary statement at the end showing what will happen if torture is continued in the countries. So let's go ahead and look at another sample introduction or conclusion paragraph rather. And this conclusion paragraph is going to demonstrate how you might incorporate a new crappy quote into your closing paragraph to introduce your cautionary or beneficial closing statement. And again, we'll want to note those rhetorical devices in red. So beginning with my reverse thesis, to close, because individual students only need additional work when they do not understand a concept, homework is unnecessary for all students. Therefore, mandatory homework in every class is meaningless and cumbersome and unproductive. So really pointing out my view about homework with that polysyndeton here. Instead, teachers should assign homework on an individual basis. This solution would provide students with needed practice without needless busy work for students and endless grading for teachers. Using that parallel structure to reinforce one of my arguments and opinion in my speech. It is important to remember that studies have shown positive results in student learning when students are able to spend time with friends, explore extracurricular activities, and enjoy other interests, hobbies after school, and stressing out over 3 to 4 hours of homework each night. A very powerful piece of evidence that I used in the body of my speech there that I thought would really leave a good impression with my audience members. When they have a mental break at home, students come into the classroom ready to learn and focus the next day. According to high schools with the highest test scores across the country, homework should only be used to gauge student learning and understanding. And so I chose this quote by Dr. Smith to gradually move into my last statement of my conclusion paragraph. And so you'll notice that the sentence after this quote is some transitioning sentence that explains the meaning that I wanted to focus on in including this quote in my conclusion paragraph. So let's go ahead and read that. As Dr. Smith of Harvard University suggests, so a lot of ethos there for this quote, when students complete homework based on their ability levels, teachers may easily track student understanding and know how to differentiate their teaching to improve student learning. When students work on their own weaknesses rather than work assigned to the whole class, they will quickly see improvement and will be more motivated, focused, engaged, and willing to work to stay in school. So leaving my audience members here with a really strong beneficial statement showing that if students actually focus on their own weaknesses with their homework, then all of the good that will come from that for students. This amplification example in red here really makes my audience members focus on this final beneficial statement that I want them to listen to. So you are going to now create your conclusion paragraph for your speech, and I would encourage you to go back and read through the samples and the strategies that you feel like you want to incorporate in your own conclusion paragraph.